We're going to start. We're going to start the next session. Everybody, please take your seats. I know that you're hungry, but we're gonna offer you 1 hour of food for thought, and then following that, we'll actually offer some food. I'm very, very happy to introduce two of the people I respect and admire most, Susan Glasser and Frank Fukuyama. Both of them helped me a lot to understand this wild and confusing world we live in today. I compulsively read everything they write, and in Susan's case, listen faithfully to the splendid and very popular weekly podcast she hosts called Global Politico. Susan is Politico's chief international affairs columnist. She was a founding editor of Politico magazine and is the former editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine. Frank is now senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University and directs this Institute's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. I'm very happy and proud that Frank is also a member of the Inter-American Dialogue. He's been a great supporter of our work, and he's written actually a lot about Latin America and visits the region frequently. He's in big demand in Latin America. Susan and Frank are also two of the busiest people around, so I am very, very grateful to both of them for finding time in their calendars to join us for what I know will be a very stimulating conversation. Susan, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Michael. I have to say, I know Frank and I are both a little bit intimidated. Being between lunch and a conversation is always a risky place to be. But we want to thank you for convening us today and for that very generous introduction. I assure you, I did not pay him to advertise either of us, but we're delighted to be here. And I have to say, for me, I'm just very much looking forward to this conversation with Frank, because I want to know what he thinks, as I imagine all of you do too as well. And I will try to make sure that we get a chance to have questions from people here before we close up today. But you know, I was thinking there's so many different subjects we could start with, but let's be honest. You know, there's an elephant in the room. And so we might as well talk about Donald Trump. Perhaps he's not so much of an elephant as Republicans on Capitol Hill these days are beginning to wonder whether he is in fact really a member of the GOP or not. What do you make, Frank, of the events of the last few weeks? Even by the standards of Trump time, it feels like we're in a rapidly accelerating news cycle.
Well, thanks, Susan. And by the way, let me put in a little plug for the Inter-American Dialogue. I was on the board for a number of years. I love this organization, and I'm really extremely happy to participate here in this CAF conference with all of you. So, as an American citizen, I have been really horrified at the rise of Donald Trump, because he struck me as someone that had all of the wrong personal characteristics to be president, for reasons I don't have to elaborate, and his policies really did not seem to be ones that would be very productive for the United States. However, I must say, as a political scientist, this has been a fascinating experiment, because the American founding fathers created our constitutional system precisely to deal with someone like Donald Trump. The founding fathers were worried about what they called Caesarism, meaning you'd have some extremely ambitious individual who would try to accumulate power, and the entire American system of checks and balances is there to keep that person contained. And so it was an interesting question whether that system would work or not. I think 8 months into his presidency that so far things are holding well. He has tried to attack a whole number of important American institutions. He started off his presidency dismissing the entire intelligence community. The mainstream media is the enemy of the American people. He's ridiculed individual judges. He's contemplated firing the special prosecutor. I mean, all of these things that are classic behavior of a would-be authoritarian populist leader, and he hasn't been able to get away with any of that. In fact, even with a Republican majority in both houses, they were not able to repeal Obamacare. And so in terms of a legislative and I promised you he's not going to get his wall either. So there's many things that he promised that he's not been able to do. What's fascinating about just the last 48 hours is this turn that he's made, because he is not by any means a conventional, or at least he did not campaign as a conventional orthodox conservative Republican, meaning low taxes, cut the welfare state, that sort of thing. He campaigned as a populist. It was very strange that he actually wanted to take benefits away. You know, in Argentina, populists shower their supporters with benefits, and Trump was trying to do the opposite. He was trying to take people, you know, off of health care. And so for the first few months of his presidency, he campaigned as an orthodox, conservative, small government Republican. I thought that this was a tremendous mistake on his part, because if he had reached out to the Democrats early in his administration on an issue like infrastructure and made that his first big initiative, he could have gotten a great deal of support from Democrats to spend $1 trillion or whatever the figure was on something that both parties would have actually supported. It would have been good for his base, and the most important thing was it would have been great for him as a leader, because, and that's what Ronald Reagan did. Ronald Reagan did a bunch of tax cuts and other big initiatives early in his administration with the help of Tip O'Neill and the Democratic Party. He could not have done that, and in our system, you can't really do things unless you get some degree of bipartisan cooperation. So he didn't do this, and as a result, he kept going to these rallies in red states where you have these fanatically cheering people that represent, you know, at most 30% of the American population. He seemed to revel in that kind of adulation, but it was hurting him as a powerful president. So now he's made this interesting pivot just in the last day, cooperating with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi to raise the debt ceiling. And actually what's interesting is, and we should talk about DACA a little bit further, because actually I agree that I think that DACA is of questionable constitutionality, and it actually is something that Congress should pass a law on. And so now he's passed that to Congress in this bipartisan framework where, you know, if the Democrats want to play with him, they could actually get legislation on this in the next few months. And that's really fascinating. So in one sense, it's good because actually he will do things that will be good for the country. On the other hand, you know, it's also going to lead to a path where he could actually develop some of that charismatic, you know, power and influence that he would really need if he were going to be a dangerous populist leader.
Well, that's an interesting question. So by your definition of populism, I think you wrote once that really populism is a bunch of policies that elites don't like and that are supported by a lot of people. Trump campaigned using some of the tools of populism, but do you see him as actually having a populist agenda at this point?
Well, he did, in the sense that his economic policies were nationalist in a way that the working class base that was the core of his support, you know, really favored. And by the way, Bernie Sanders, you know, ended up supporting many of those same things. They both didn't like Goldman Sachs and the role of, you know, big money in American politics. He also said that he was not going to touch the core elements of the welfare state, meaning Medicare and Social Security. So in that sense, he certainly talked like a populist. The other thing that is harder to perceive if you're not in the middle of American politics, I think, is just the rhetoric. You know, so we elites here in Washington, we're very globalized and cosmopolitan, and he says things that are manifestly false, outrageous, and we say, how can a president say such a stupid thing, you know? And he seemed to escalate this, you know, week by week. But I think that we're not listening actually to the way he relates to his supporters, because what they like is the fact that he's honest. He's not politically correct. He says what he thinks, and it's like he's shoving this in the face of people like us and getting us mad. And I think it's that ability to connect to people who have been ignored by both political parties. They've been largely invisible, I think, to both the Republicans and the Democrats, meaning this old white working class base. And I think his outrageousness, in a way, is a direct way of speaking to them. So that's the other sense in which he's populist. He's not a sophisticated, cosmopolitan, well-educated leader like Obama was.
But he went to the best universities.
Yeah,
Don't
that's
forget
right.
that. Let's unpack a little bit this question of how we should contextualize what's happening here in the United States globally. I mean, I think that's a big question that people have. Is this just some crazy outlier, historical accident of history that has occurred here in the United States? Does it fit in more broadly with the rise of, say, right-wing populists and authoritarians we've seen in Eastern Europe? How does it connect with Latin America? Is there a global context for Donald Trump, or is he just some crazy one-off?
No, there's certainly a global trend towards populist nationalism. So I would define populist nationalism in the following way. So populists do things that are popular in the short run, but they're not sustainable and disastrous in the long run. The charismatic authority is really important, so a populist leader does not want to work through institutions. They want a direct connection with the people. And that kind of leader, and I think further, what these leaders are doing is using a democratic mandate. They're legitimately elected democratically, and they're using that to undermine all of the other institutions of the state, meaning an impartial bureaucracy and the rule of law. All right? So who has been doing this in recent years? First and foremost was Vladimir Putin. He was legitimately elected president of Russia. He's essentially undermined the rule of law in that country. He's presided over a kleptocracy. So all of the other institutions have gotten eroded. Viktor Orban in Hungary and his Fidesz party has done something similar with the big parliamentary majority that they've had. Now the Law and Justice Party in Poland has gone after their constitutional court and their justice system, in a really big way. So all of those, I think, represent a similar kind of impulse. It's based on the same kind of sociology. This is the support base for all of these. Oh, by the way, Erdogan in Turkey, I think, is another case of this. In every case, the social divide is between urbanized, better educated, higher income people and people that live in more rural areas, less educated. In most countries, they tend to be older. So Putin is not popular in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Erdogan is not popular in Ankara and Istanbul. If you look at the map of Donald Trump's victory, Hillary Clinton had all these blue dots concentrated in cities, and then even in red states, the university town or the capital city would be blue. Everything else was red, right? So that works very much in this country. It's different from the populism in Latin America, and I think that this is there's a tendency of people to lump all of these things together as a similar phenomenon. In the Western world, or the developed world, these populists are people who had been middle class or lower middle class or working class who have lost status, largely because of globalization. The IMF did a study that was published about a month ago, which is really fascinating. It's not just looking at income inequality, it's looking at the middle of the income distribution in the United States and in other developed countries and seeing what happened. And so first of all, it turns out that 50% of Americans have real incomes that were no higher than they were in 2000. And a tiny fraction of them got out of the middle class by moving up, and a significant number actually moved down in terms of their rank within the the national income distribution. And this is, whereas in Latin America, I mean, the populism is a more classic form where there's a kind of, narrow group of well-to-do people at the top, and then a big mass of people that are in the informal economy, don't have stable jobs, and so forth. And so I think Latin American populism has therefore drifted to a more classic left-wing, form of redistribution, policy. When it's a middle class that is pushed downwards in the social hierarchy, that gets mixed up with a lot of identity issues, because it's not just the lack of income, it's the lack of social state or the loss of social status that I think really affects people. And that's the point at which, if you have a middle class that thought of themselves as the core of American identity, these were the people that, built cars and made steel and everything else, and all of a sudden they're the ones that are suffering from an opioid epidemic and broken families and living in deteriorating neighborhoods. This, becomes a very toxic stew, and I think that's why identity issues, and primarily the issue of immigration, have been so important in these Northern European populist movements. I mean, there the sociology is again very similar. This is all based on the old industrial working class losing social status.
So you see that as the differentiator with the Latin American crises that are occurring right now? Or if you look at Brazil, for example, or Venezuela, you see that as more economically rooted than what's happening here in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think Latin America's enduring social problem has always been inequality. And you had middle classes that were actually, in many countries, relatively small and usually tied to the state sector, in some way. And then you had a very large number of, of pretty poor people that lived in the countryside, peasants, and so forth. And that's why I think you've still got Marxism in Latin America. I mean, Marxism was designed, for that kind of, classic inequality. I think what you're seeing in the developed world is really a different thing. My former teacher and mentor, Samuel Huntington, wrote a classic book called Political Order in Changing Societies back in the 1960s. And in it, he said, if you look around the world, the bulk of instability is actually not caused by very poor people generally. It's usually caused by people that think that they're middle class and are losing that middle class state. The French Revolution was really about that you had growth before the French Revolution, it stalled, and all of a sudden there was a lot of educated lawyers that really got upset at the monarchy. And I think something like that is really what's going on in, the Netherlands, France, Britain, the United States, and so forth. And that, that is somewhat different from, I think, the kind of populism. And by the way, the cycles, as everyone understands, are really on different time frames. And so the Latin American wave, that started with Chavez is now fortunately receding, and our wave has just started. But they are, slightly different, I think, in social emphasis.
Huntington obviously wrote about the sort of third wave of democratization, and yet, with the collapse of the Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union, that's now a full generation ago, and you have a look at Freedom House's index of democracies in the world. It's been going backwards every year, I believe, for the last 11 years in a row. And so I guess the question is, again, goes to this issue of how much is unique to each society, how much are we seeing a particular historical moment, and does that mean that we're at the fraying of a liberal world order, and whatever that is?
Well, this is a topic that we've been debating endlessly especially in the last year. So I think the general context for this is pretty clear, that globalization, meaning the free movement of people, goods, investment, ideas across international borders, that kind of an open trading world, economic world, is good for aggregate growth. All right, this is the thing you learn in a basic trade theory course, and that was true. So between 1970 in 2008, the crisis in 2008, the global output of the world economy quadrupled, right? So unbelievable amounts of new wealth were created. But the same textbooks will tell you that in a free trade world, not everybody benefits. And in particular, the rising middle classes in places like China and India, a lot of those new jobs were coming at the expense of the old working class in developed societies. And, so that feeds into this populist, downward mobility that I was just talking about. Now, there's other things I think that are going on, which is that as time goes by, people begin to take democracy for granted. So in Poland is the most amazing case, I think, in certain ways. Poland was one of the first countries, the Solidarity movement led the move out of communism. You had these heroic people like Lech Wałęsa, Tadeusz Mazowiecki that created a real thriving democracy. Not only that, Poland was the most successful member of the European Union over the past 10 years. It had the highest rate of economic growth, high rates of employment, so the country really ought to be, quite happy. And instead they cast out the Civic Union Party that had presided over that growth, and they vote in this populist, rural-based party that represents the Poles that didn't benefit, as much from that growth. And I think that unfortunately you now have a whole generation of people in Eastern Europe who were born way after the fall of communism. They don't remember what it's like to live in an authoritarian, society. And so they can take risks in voting for, new populist politicians that are offering them things which, in the context of the European Union, the European Union does stuff that people don't like, and so there is some real cause for grievance.
Well, I think that's such an important insight about, the historical memory and how much it does play a role. I lived in Russia for 4 years at the very beginning of Putin's first term, and I think it challenged my expectations in exactly that way. I spent a year going to a high school history class, and I thought, this will be interesting to see how they talk about the Soviet Union, and the context, I thought, would be these are up-and-coming young Moscow students, high school students. They want to build a future in the new Russia. And the history teacher, she'll surely be mired in the past, because who would be a poorly paid history teacher in the public schools in Moscow? And of course it was exactly the opposite, because she remembered the indignities of communism, and she tried to explain to this class. She talked about, having to stand online for toilet paper for 4 hours, whereas these kids didn't remember that. They'd been fed this diet of Putin nationalism, and on the first week of class, she had a vote. They talked about the Russian Revolution. She said, well, which side would you be on? The Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks, or the short-lived provisional government, the Democrats, small d? Not surprising, but Lenin won big time in that, and the full end of the year later, it wasn't that different. But so I want to challenge you then on you started out actually on a somewhat optimistic note when it came to Trump and the strength of institutions when challenged by not only a politician who's an outsider, but also this populist wave. What do you perceive to be the consequences on institutions? In other words, they might be built for a challenge like this, but clearly there is going to be consequences both for the United States internally and also potentially around the world. What are some of those consequences?
Well, yeah, that's a really important question, because even if Trump doesn't get to do some of the scarier things that he has threatened to do in terms of protectionism or security, he could still erode institutions in a long-term fashion in ways that would be very damaging. So, for example, the rule of law, just challenging judges, criticizing judges as being politicized, that is something that other politicians may start to pick up. Certainly, he is, and Susan, I'm sure you're aware of this more than anybody else. I mean, this just wholesale attack on the mainstream media, which is just unprecedented. He said the mainstream media is the enemy of the American people. to get rhetoric like that from a politician, you really have to go back to Stalin or Hitler or someone of that sort. Now, actually, I think it's actually probably strengthened the mainstream media in a certain sense, and that's part of the resilience of the system. But it is the case that the media environment in the United States has just disintegrated, with the rise of fake news and this, the fact that people live in these information bubbles where they don't agree on just basic facts. I mean, the world watching Fox News is just totally different from the world that you see if you watch, CNN, that sort of thing. And that's not just Trump. He's accelerated that, but that's something that's been, the byproduct, I think, of this longer-term polarization in American politics. And so that's something that's going to remain. Corruption. So the last panel was on corruption. I mean, we've never had a president that was running a big family business at the same time he was president. I mean, yeah, okay, technically he's not running it, but, that's not much of a separation. And again, that's very worrisome because it sets all sorts of precedents for other, I think the real danger is that there's a lot of billionaires out there that would like to get involved in politics. And one of the big obstacles to doing that in the United States is traditionally that you got to take a big pay cut. But Trump's now set this, this precedent where you don't have to. And maybe you can just keep all of your assets and they can keep earning money. So these are the longer term, dangers I think that we see.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. When Trump first was rising last year and right around his inauguration,
Bem, no ano passado, vimos que havia uma disfunção do sistema em vez de
the legacy that he leaves behind, right? He talks about draining the swamp, for example, but we're here in Washington, and there's another saying, which is, in Washington, it's like a casino, right? And the house always wins. Mm-hmm. And that sooner or later, Washington will figure out a way to co-opt or otherwise, dilute, take over the agenda of someone like a Trump.
Well, that's an extremely good point. It's not as if the American political system was working well before Donald Trump came along. I mean, there are really big problems. The way I had analyzed it in my last book on political order and political decay was the following, that the American system has a lot of checks and balances. Quite grateful that they're there right now, but it has more than Germany or certainly Britain or other kinds of democratic systems. And what's happened with the rise of polarization and the rise of very well-organized interest groups is they've made use of those checks in the system to just paralyze government. So take a basic government function like passing an annual budget. In fact, the IMF says you should do a medium-term 5-year budget. I mean, if we can get through the end of the fiscal year actually with a budget in place, that's a miracle, but that hasn't happened in many of the last 20 years. Congress has not passed a budget under regular order. There have been these periodic shutdowns and confrontations over the debt limit and that sort of thing. The reason for that is that the American system, the two parties for most of the 20th century overlapped, very considerably. And every major piece of legislation, from the New Deal to the Great Society to the Reagan tax cuts, were done on the basis of cooperation between the two parties. They've now split apart, so they're much more like European ideological parties, and they're evenly balanced, and that's the reason that you've had this deadlock. So this is a general comment that I think applies also to Latin America. I don't like presidential systems. I'm sorry that so many Latin American countries copied the American system. And I think if you look at your continent in general, the problem with the presidential system, obviously, is if the executive and the legislature are held by different parties, you get gridlock. And then the temptation is to get around that system by strengthening the executive through emergency powers or executive orders and so forth. And that is exactly the path that we are, following. So we're becoming more Latin American by the day. Obama, after 2010, when the Republicans took control of the House, found that he couldn't pass anything, and then started to issue executive orders. So this is a good excuse for me to talk about DACA, because this is a good example of it. In theory, there should be a political basis for comprehensive immigration reform. A number of presidents have tried to do this. The last one that got the furthest was George W. Bush. Obama wanted to do it. He never got around to it. The basis for the deal has always been there. It's basically tougher enforcement measures for existing levels of immigration, coupled with a path to citizenship for all of the 11, 12 million undocumented aliens in the country, all right? You can probably, in poll terms, get a majority of Americans that would say, yeah, that strikes me as a kind of fair deal for solving this thing. The problem is that in our system, at both ends of the spectrum, you have conservative Republicans that are absolutely opposed to anything looking remotely like amnesty. And on the other hand, you have a part of the Democratic Party that supports, the rights of undocumented aliens, is not interested in, any kind of stronger enforcement. And actually, they both agree on things like a national ID card. They don't like it. And that's what you'd need really to do employer sanctions, that sort of thing. And so we've had a system that should have done comprehensive immigration reform 15, 20 years ago. The Jordan Commission back in the 1990s saying similar kinds of things. It hasn't happened because of the dysfunctionality of the system. And that's why Obama, did DACA. I mean, because Congress was not willing or able to do its job and pass legislation that would have exempted those young children from deportation, he simply did it by an executive order. And this is where I'm not a lawyer, but I've talked to a number of constitutional lawyers. The Obama based this on basically prosecutorial discretion, which is true in our common law system, that you can decide to not prosecute people. That's the way you do plea bargains and that sort of thing. But the usual understanding of this is you do it in an individual case when you're negotiating with a particular defendant. You don't do it for a class of people that includes like 800,000 people. That's policy. That's something that Congress really ought to legislate about. But Congress has been, unable to do this. And that's kind of the deep dysfunction in the system that has preceded Donald Trump and will exist once Donald Trump is gone. So this is the difficult thing. If you ever say anything that seems remotely supportive of anything Trump has said or done, you face a lot of opprobrium. But I actually think that they may be right, that there are a number of suits by state attorney generals, that DACA was actually unconstitutional. And my suspicion was the Supreme Court might have thrown this out, down the road. And I actually think it's appropriate that it be sent back to Congress, because Congress ought to do its goddamn job and legislate on what to do with these undocumented people in the United States. And if, this move just in the last day actually creates a bipartisan way of doing that, I think that's great. I think Congress really ought to move on that, and that's kind of one of the ways of getting our system unblocked.
Well, you talk about unblocking the system, and actually Trump and immigration is an interesting example, because arguably, perhaps not the election of Trump, but the election of a Republican president and a Republican Congress is the other historical way to get around gridlock in the system. Americans believed they elected a government all of one party for the first time in a long time to overcome what they perceived of as the gridlock and the dysfunction of the later Obama years. And so now you have this very interesting spectacle of the president running against the Republicans of his own party in a way that seems to undercut the system's effort to correct in the way that we're more familiar with. And you got to look at this and see this as potentially a function of Donald Trump's incredibly low poll numbers, and that he now is perhaps the most unpopular president for someone so early in his term of anything we've seen in recent memory. And so I guess that's the part where Trump seems to be diverging from the playbook
yes. No, that's definitely right. That actually may turn out to be a brilliant move on his part. But the other underlying reality is that both of the parties, but particularly the Republican Party, they're not united, you know. And the fact that you haven't been able to repeal the Affordable Care Act, given the dominance of both houses of Congress and the presidency, is evidence of that you've got this Tea Party, the Freedom Caucus, especially in the House of Representatives, that are these, I mean, I just think that there's these small government anti-tax fanatics who are extremely opposed to almost government per se, right? And then you've got the mainstream part of the party that represents all the businessmen and CEOs that kind of realize that you got to have a government and you need regulation and that sort of thing. And then you've now got this populist wing that Trump has largely on his own created, which really didn't exist before. These people had largely been ignored by both the Freedom Caucus people and by the mainstream wing of the Republican Party, and now they're out there and they're angry. And so, in a sense, that party has really, you know, disintegrated in terms of these different social groups. And, you know, the logic is that actually you ought to join up with somebody from the other side of the aisle that, you know, may share some of your, you know, your policy agenda.
Well, your point, though, was that he should have arguably done that early on in his term. It's hard to see this being a lasting new coalition. If Donald Trump is disliked by 60% of the American electorate overall right now, I think that was the latest poll number, the Democratic part of the electorate, capital D, you know, he's disliked by, you know, historic numbers. I mean, over 80, 90%. And so the idea that Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are going to forge a durable coalition with him when even speaking with him, you know, is perceived as apostasy on their part. It's just really hard to see that Trump has that available, especially given the investigations of him and the other controversies that he's already acquired in just, you know, not even 8 months in
Well,
office.
there's two flies in the ointment, though. I mean, I basically agree with you that he would have done much better to reach out to the Democrats right away after he was elected. And now there's so much distrust of him on, you know, outside of that 30% of core supporters that it's going to be very hard to do that. But there's two things that may work in his favor. So one is actually the economy. The economy is doing pretty well. You know, the revised figures for the second quarter, 3% growth. They're not 4%, but they're, you know, they're not bad. And that could actually continue long enough, you know, to get you to the midterms in 2018, even to, you know, the 2020 election. The other big you know, casino, well, I don't know, whatever it is, risk factor out there is foreign policy. Many people, myself included, are really worried about what's going to happen with North Korea. It's a really dangerous situation. And it is entirely possible that Trump will decide on some kind of military action. It will either go wrong or it'll provoke an escalation, and we're going to be in a really, really big mess, with lots of implications for global trade and everything else. However, I think one thing that people are not thinking straight about is that he could actually do a military action, and it would turn out that the North Koreans don't have the stomach, you know, to actually go to war with the United States, and they back down. And then Trump looks like a genius all of a sudden. I mean, he, when he did the military strike against Syria, he actually, you know, got a lot of approbation from even a lot of Democrats. And if he were the first president to actually solve this North Korea problem, you know, he would be in the driver's seat, you know, so anyhow, I'm not predicting that this will happen, but I just think that.
But this is what keeps you up at night, because you mentioned this actually earlier, not in the context of North Korea. Basically, it's the Trump success scenario that worries you from the point of view of democracy.
Yes.
See, we're laughing here. This is a reflection of where we've come as a society, but you're not the only person I've had this conversation with. Your concern is that empowering him through success, raising his approval ratings, raising his ability to negotiate better hand with Congress and leaders in his own party as well as Democrats, potentially is when he would be able to do more than just talk about his anti-democratic impulses when it comes to American institutions or the rule of law or judges.
Yes.
That's the case?
Yeah, I mean, as a patriotic American, I hate to say this because you want your country to do well, and it's hard for the United States to do well if the president doesn't do well. But in this case, there is this trade-off because I do think that, and again, this is the danger of both populism and also I think of presidential systems, that they have this tendency to coalesce around individuals rather than institutions. And again, that is the big temptation, that the need to get something done is so overwhelming that you forget about the institutional framework that produces that outcome. And so it is a trade-off, I think, between actually a kind of short-term policy success and the long-term health of American institutions.
So by this argument, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi probably shouldn't be making any more deals with Donald Trump.
Well, we'll see.
All right, well, I want to bring the audience into this conversation. While you're getting your questions ready, I'm sure there's microphones as well. Please do make sure you make it a question and let us know who you are. So, there you go.
Hi there. My name is Greg Payne with Emerging Market Enterprise. We do consulting for startups in... Sorry, what? Am I on? No. I heard somebody say something. Thank you so much for this talk. I'm sure myself and everybody in the room has wondered about this Trump effect. Now, I happen to be one of those people who, while absolutely disappointed in who the president is right now, I'm delighted by the fact that his election has encouraged more participation in our democracy. So if we can assume that there's more participation, more action, activism, whatever you might want to call it, and if we also assume that Trump has done and will continue to do a lot of damage to our democratic institutions, I'm curious if you could, in your crystal ball, tell us how we're going to recover from this, and more importantly, how we're going to return to normal, how we could possibly even have a more stronger, more resilient, more participatory democracy after this, and also pretty importantly, how do we avoid swinging too far the other way? If there are any case studies or
I can't wait to hear your answer to this.
Yeah, it'll solve everything.
Yeah, so there are several trends that Trump has set in motion that will survive him. So it is true that in a sense he's been good for democracy because he has responded to this demand for representation and recognition by this old white working class that really wasn't being well served. The problem is that the way he's mobilized them, they're extremely angry, and it's, they're going to be a powerful interest group that's going to be very hard to make deals with in the future because of, the way that they were mobilized. The other thing that's going on is within the Democratic Party. It's moved to the left as a result of Trump. That old centrist, Bill Clinton kind of formula that worked so well in the 1990s has been discredited, and I think that party has got, in a way, deeper, or let's say equally deep problems because it really has been built around identity politics. The last few elections have been won by Democratic presidential candidates by mobilizing, African Americans, Hispanics, women, the LGBT community, all of these different groups without an overriding clear economic message, right? So how do you get out of this? Well, I actually think that leadership still matters in democracies, and if you get the right combination of ways of understanding and then explaining to the American people what the sources of their problems are and a clear way forward, I still think that you can pull both parties back from that kind of extreme polarization. Do I see a politician out there that I think is capable of doing this? No. But nobody saw Donald Trump, 18 months ago, so miracles can happen.
All right. Ma'am. Sorry, right behind you.
Hi, good afternoon. Shanta Walcott. I'm a pollster here in Washington. I'm with the Institute for Caribbean Studies. I have a question for you regarding deliberative democracy. How can we reframe the contextual arguments that we're looking at right now with regards to the president and the policies on DACA and so many other challenges that we're faced with right now? How can we bring the electorate closer to the conversation? Thank you.
You know, that's actually an extremely complicated issue because there have been a number of efforts to increase political participation since the 1970s that have actually contributed to polarization. And there's actually a number of examples of this. Probably the most important one is party primaries, right? So presidential candidates were selected basically in a back room by the party elite up until Watergate and all the scandals in the 1970s, and then both parties went in big time for popular primaries. And the result of this, the problem is that in a primary, the only people that vote are activists. And one of the reasons that the Republican Party has moved so far to the right is that they can put up a Tea Party challenger that will win the Republican nomination, but is much more likely to lose in a general election. And that's, you know, part of the reason for the drift in that party. And so that's a case of how more activism and more participation has actually led to an unanticipated, you know, I think negative consequence. There are other things like popular referenda and so forth that have had that. So I think that, you know, I guess I don't have a very good institutional recipe for doing this. One thing I think would be quite helpful is if you could get rid of the plurality voting system in the United States, this first past the post single member district system that we have, and replace it with something like a limited preferential vote or an alternative vote. There are different names for this that's used in Australia that would actually permit the emergence of third parties, because right now our system really discourages any competition to the Republicans and Democrats. And I think what you can see, you know, pretty evidently is that there's a lot of Democrats that are not happy with a lot of trends in their party, and there's a lot, and the Republicans are divided into these different tribes. And if you had an easier entry of third parties into the electoral system, that might actually give voice to some of these subgroups within the two existing parties, which would, you know, encourage greater participation. As a political scientist, I can't get my mind around a democratic system that can work without